Welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality, and we're so glad you're here. This is a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we greatly appreciate your support. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure and like, share, and subscribe to any of the social media content platforms that you're using. And then if you go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, you can make a one-time donation, or with a monthly subscription, you'll gain access to our bonus content. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. Welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're joining us. I am so honored to have Brian Mclaren on with us today. Brian is an author, speaker, activist, pastor, singer-songwriter. Yeah, go to Bandcamp and look up Brian Mclaren and listen to some songs there. I've just, and honestly, Brian and I have just talked a few times on the phone just in the last couple of months. Brian, I was in my whole last 3 years where I kind of lost my career, marriage, my community, and even my faith to some degree. I was in such a low spot, almost not suicidal, but a notch above it. And a friend of mine mailed me a copy of Richard Rohr's book, Falling Upward. And I hate to say it, but as all the years as an evangelical, I'd heard of Richard Rohr, but I'd never had read his stuff. And I started reading. Last 2 or 3 years, I've read all of his stuff, or a lot of his stuff. It's hard to read all of it, but and then I know I was trying to reach him, and then I noticed you'd been working with him, and I thought, oh my gosh, I think I know some people that know Brian, and so my friend Carl Medeiros connected us, and you were so gracious to connect with me, and I appreciate that so much.
It's been great getting to know you, Fred.
Now I've reread, I looked through my library and I already had a bunch of your books, Generous Orthodoxy, A New Kind of Christian. I had Everything Must Change, but the 2 books that I've read just in the last couple of months are Faith After Doubt and Do I Stay Christian? And that's what I want to focus on. But before we get there, I kind of want to do 2 things to sort of introduce the audience to sort of put this talk on a map, and particularly put these 2 books on the map, sort of the spiritual map of America, and maybe mostly America, right? Not necessarily the whole world, but but I was thinking particularly like the story of American Christianity in the last 5 decades. Like from the time we were born till now.
Yes. Yeah.
You think about, like, would you summarize for us quickly, like the decline of the church in America and the rise of the nuns, not N-U-Ns, but the N-O-N-Es, like the demographic category. Give us your quick take on that, because I want to get to the books, right? But give us your quick take on that landscape of American Christianity.
Yeah, I'm a bit older than you, so
not much.
Fred, but one place to start is to say that in the 1950s, when I was born, it was a high water mark for church attendance in the United States. The Catholic Church was strong. Mainline Protestant churches were strong. Evangelical and fundamentalist Pentecostal churches were strong. It was like a bull market for religion in America in the 1950s. And in the 1960s, what happened was that mainline Protestantism, that had been sort of the backbone of American religious life, reached its high water mark in the 1960s. And there are a whole lot of reasons we could talk about for that. We can come back. We can go back to that if you want. But they began to decline by the late 1960s. So they've had a pretty steady decline now for decades. These are Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians, and so on. Evangelicals thought, oh man, we're still going strong. And in fact, a lot of people who dropped out of mainline churches joined evangelical churches. So they felt, they were in a bull market. And Pentecostals were having this thing called the charismatic movement that was growing. So there was just a lot going on there. But then something really interesting happened in the late 1970s. Conservative political leaders and conservative evangelical leaders got together and made some deals. There's a lot of research we can point to on this, but they made some deals. And they formed an alliance that we now know as the religious right. And so from the late 70s through the 80s and the 90s, that really exploded and increased their political power. And they had a huge media footprint. And so they have continued to grow. And interestingly, they made an alliance with conservative Catholics, so that the religious right became a Catholic and Protestant phenomenon. And what that has tended to do in recent decades is that younger generations and more highly educated people have become less and less comfortable with the religious right. So what that has done then is actually lead to a decline among evangelicals and Roman Catholics. So now, in a sense, all of the major sectors of Christianity are, if not in a numerical decline, they're in a decline in percentage of population. And so that's the big story. And and to make matters worse, there have been a lot of scandals in the Catholic Church and in the evangelical church, all kinds of scandals. And that just adds disillusionment to the whole affair. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And my own story is a little bit of a disillusionment,
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
For many people, including myself. So, and so it's interesting because I grew up Southern Baptist and then got into the Vineyard movement, right? Yeah. And started this church in 1990, and it grew to several thousand people in the 90s and 2000s. It really grew every year for almost 28 years.
Yeah.
And so, the world that you talked about, and what's interesting is that the Southern, Catholic being the largest denomination in America, and then Southern Baptist being the largest Protestant denomination.
Yes.
I think about 15 years ago, for the first time, maybe 10, 15 years ago, Southern Baptist started declining every year. Is that correct?
That's right. And they have taken great pride that it was their conservative theology that made them stay strong, but they didn't change their theology. In fact, it maybe has become more conservative, but the numbers have gone down. And can I just say, Fred, thinking about, what I said about scandals and so on, what I think has been especially hard for people, it's not what you are an example of. It's when people, do things that were problematic, and then they blame somebody else or they deny it or whatever, and I think it's almost refreshing to people when some leader has a problem and then they admit it and they face it and they
own it.
They own it. Yeah. That I think people are very, very forgiving. We all know we have our problems, right?
Right.
But I think the problem in religion is when, and what even is worse, when people then, it's almost as if their own, whether it's guilt or shame or whatever, they turn into aggression toward other people and start attacking other people. And that just adds to this feeling of disillusionment. And when you brought up the nuns, then a whole lot of people say, I'm not less spiritual than I was before. I'm probably more spiritual, but the whole religion side of it is less appealing. So then they say, I'm a nun when it comes to religion, but I'm in there with some form of spirituality.
Yeah, I hear you. Like 2.5 years, I've been in the recovery world, and then I'm also hanging out with a ton of young people in the deconstruction world.
Yeah.
And then I've got whole bunches of friends in the LGBTQ world.
Yes.
And I think being a fallen megachurch pastor who's humble and owns his own problems is way more refreshing to those people than if I'd still been a megachurch pastor. It's kind of ironic, right?
It is ironic, but in another way, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. One of the best things that ever happened to me when I was a pastor is we started having a lot of folks from the recovery world come to our church. I think at one point our church was probably 50% maybe even more people in recovery. And I would start getting invited to speak at meetings and anniversaries and then at retreats in the recovery world. And I learned so much from those experiences. It enriched my life in incredible ways.
Yeah, me too. Though it's been awfully painful to have arrived in those spaces at this place and time in my life. It's been so many things I've been grateful for. I've fallen in love with some of these communities, right?
Yes, that's right.
So let's connect your story real quick. Where did you grow up and your faith denomination, and then kind of give us a quick rundown of your journey into sort of the world of challenging, questioning, and doubting your faith, but where it started and then where it landed.
I was born in upstate New York, lived most of my life in Maryland, and for the last 14 years have lived in Florida, but most of my growing up was in New York and a short time in Illinois and then in Maryland. And I was born in what people today would call a fundamentalist family or an evangelical family. A little denomination called the Plymouth Brethren, which don't refer to themselves as a denomination, but if people have heard of Garrison Keillor, Prairie Home Companion, that's his background. Garrison Keillor. And Jim Wallace is from that background as well. Some people
love Jim Wallace. Yeah.
But very loving, sincere, zealous people, but very literalistic in the way they read the Bible. And they tended to think that, we were the only people who really had it right. So that's what I grew up in. And when you grow up, this is something I never can forget. However a person grows up, they have no choice in that. And of course they believe what they're taught by their parents when they're kids. So I have great empathy for people, whatever their background in this. But I, even as a young kid, I was a questioning kid. I was interested in science. And I remember as a young boy thinking, by the time I'm 18, I'll be out of here because I believe in evolution and I'm interested in science. And a lot of this stuff seems not very realistic to me. So, but then in my teenage years, I had this very powerful spiritual experience. Some folks will have heard of something called the Jesus movement back in the late 60s, early 70s. And that was my context for having this very powerful experience. Ended up, my plan was to be a college English teacher, and I taught college English for a while. But then I was involved with a group of people who started a little church, and I ended up becoming the pastor of that church and served as pastor there for 24 years. But through all those years, I always was attracted to people who were honest and had good questions. And I often thought that the questions that people brought me were better than the answers I offered them.
Right.
And so questioning and doubt really remained part of my whole spiritual experience. And it took a while for me to get comfortable with that. But eventually I realized that I have come to see Jesus as the kind of person who actually was challenging people to doubt what they had been taught and to see things differently. That's why he used the word repent, which means rethink, have another thought, have second thoughts about that, have doubts about what you were told. I'm offering you a different way to think about it. And so my life these last, 20 years has been a lot about helping people think in fresh ways about their faith, and think about the way that a healthy faith affects the way we live.
Yeah, so we're both church planters.
Yeah.
And you pastored for 24 years in the DC. You were in Maryland, right? But like
That's
a
right.
suburb of
Yes.
DC. Is that right?
That's it. Yeah. Yeah.
And were you involved with a network or a particular denomination? Just independent?
Not really. We had a lot of friends of different denominations.
Yeah.
We tried to connect with everybody we could.
Right.
Yeah, but we were non-denominational. I should say that in my later years as a pastor, I became good friends with a fellow who was the director of the Vineyard churches in those years, Todd Hunter. So Todd and I became good friends for those years.
Yeah. John Wimber had asked me and Todd Hunter and Steve Sjogren and a few other guys to be on a national evangelism task force for the Vineyard when he was like in 1995. And so Steve, by the way, Steve said to say hi.
That's great.
He just texted me this morning because I told him I was doing this interview with you. So, but so that's been my tribe for, was my tribe for almost 28 years. Hasn't been for the last 3, but great love for those people. Great friends there too. So,
yes.
Okay. So you as a pastor, you're a thinker, you're always thinking outside the box. You always felt like people had questions that you didn't always have great answers for. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about your book. And then I want to save most of the time for the newest book that you sent me, Do I Stay Christian? But the first installment of that was Faith After Doubt.
Yes.
And I thought you did a brilliant job of taking some of the adult development models that you have studied so richly. You've studied those way at a much broader level than I ever did, and then kind of combine those into the 4 stages of development that that you talk about in your book, Faith After Doubt. But tell us how you came from being pastor to kind of going through those stages yourself. Maybe you were always in perplexity a little bit, or when did perplexity hit the zenith for you? But talk about those 4 stages and how that kind of related to your pastoring.
Yeah. So I'll just say first, Fred, I was exposed to theories of human development when I was a college English teacher, and as part of my professional development as a teacher, I attended a seminar where we learned about one particular theorist, and I was so interested by him that then I started reading other theorists, and it just became kind of a lifelong interest for me. And I tried to synthesize them into 4 simple stages. Anybody can remember them. First time you hear them, it's simplicity, obviously where we would start. Complexity, because if you spend a long enough time in simplicity, you realize that life is more complex. Simplicity, complexity, and then perplexity, when you begin to feel that even all of your strategies of complexity are letting you down in some ways. And then a lot of people stay in each of these stages the rest of their life. But I think more and more people are spending enough time in perplexity that they begin to edge their way into harmony. And harmony is where we learn to integrate. We learn to accept people where they are. We learn to stop assuming wherever we are is the normal place to be. And we begin to integrate some of those strengths that we developed in each of the earlier stages. I grew up in simplicity, and then I think as
do a quick thing on simplicity. It's what you're told, authority figures, black, white, right, wrong, in, out.
Yeah, the 2 big words are dualism, meaning we learn to put everything into 2 categories: us, them, in, out, safe, dangerous, friend, enemy, that kind of a thing. And the other big word is authority. We look for authority figures who tell us who goes in what category. And that's where a lot of us start. Really all the forms of Christianity that I had been introduced to were stage 1 expressions of Christianity, meaning that the adults in the room were trying to bring the children in the room to be at their level of simplicity. But then when I was in college, I met more and more people in complexity in that second stage. And that was super appealing to me because that's the stage of pragmatism, where you just want to, and you want to just learn all the information you can. Mm-hmm. So you start allowing that there's black and white, and then in between there are some stages, some shades of gray. And you want to learn all the complexities, and you want to learn all the background information. So that kept me really busy. I went to University of Maryland and studied English. Yeah.
Okay.
And got a master's degree in English there. Okay. So stage 2 is where I really like to be. And in many ways, the evangelical Christianity of, my youth was a stage 2 phenomenon. In many ways, the megachurch, I think, is a stage 2 phenomenon. People stop arguing so much about who's going to hell, and they want to talk more about how do you have a good marriage, or how do you do well at work, or how do you conquer this or that problem. These pragmatic or practical challenges. And stage 2 is a great place to be a pastor because you have all kinds of things you like to help people with. But I had dipped my toes into stage 3 as early as high school. And then by the time I was in graduate school, I was deep in stage 3. And in some ways, in my private life, I lived in stage 3. And in my public life, I tried to function in stage 2 because there weren't many people I knew who were ready for those deeper questions. Perplexity, you might call it a stage of relativism or critical thinking. When you go back and you want to face the truth, no matter how ugly and painful. And
can be cynical too, I think, right?
In fact, if you stay there long enough, you are almost guaranteed to become cynical. That's right. Especially when you never meet anyone who's beyond you. And so I wrote a song. You mentioned I was a songwriter. I wrote a song that really captured stage 3. I wrote this in my 20s, and it was called X-Ray Eyes. And the first line went, it's so sweet to complain, such fun to criticize, to see the world through penetrating X-ray eyes, to find the bad in everything, to taste the honey and think of the bee sting. That was that was my sort of ode to cynicism. Mm-hmm. And it was very hard to be in that place as a pastor because, people want you to have the answers and not. They want you to answer their questions, not question their answers.
Yeah, gosh. And then kids always ask the best questions or the hardest questions, right? Like they ask the ones that there really aren't any answers for even today, right? So.
That's, in fact, my kids often ask me the questions that I couldn't answer at all.
Yeah. Yeah, parents you bring into a kid and say like, well, where did God come from? Well, Timmy, he just always has been, Oh, that explains everything. All right. Yeah. Well, so faith after doubt was, you have been in this space of working with people whose faith had fallen apart or deconstructed or hit this stage of perplexity. Yeah. And you've been in this space for 20 years.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. More, probably 30.
Maybe more. Okay. And so this book, Faith After Doubt, was really a book to try to give people some language around their experiences and to sort of help them navigate through some of their experiences and help. And one of the things I loved about it is that you have grace for every stage. You're not trying to be like, oh, well, you haven't made it to this stage, or that.
Yeah,
you're not.
Yeah, that's
you're
right.
not approaching it from that kind of sort of superior kind of idea, right?
Yeah, because stage theories can be used to oppress people and manipulate people and shame people and gain power over people. So there's a downside in stage 3 where you learn to see the downside in things. You learn to see the downside of stage theories. So that's certainly true. That's why the metaphor I like to use is not like going from one room to another. I like to use the metaphor of a tree where you have each new growing season of a tree, it adds a new ring. And that new ring doesn't exclude the earlier rings. It includes them and expands beyond them. Yeah. And in fact, the way that it grows is by growing on the gains that were made by the previous growing seasons. And that's to me, the best way to think about stages, that we include and build upon one stage and then develop a new set of skills. In fact, all of us know this if we learn any math. Like you really do need to learn counting first, and then you learn adding, and then you learn subtracting. And you really can't get to multiplying and dividing until you've got adding and subtracting down. So you build on one set, but the new set of skills takes you someplace that the other set couldn't take you. So, and I think it works that way in a lot of domains of life.
Yeah. When you think about people, entering into to perplexity, all right. Yes. I feel like I'm a latecomer, Brian, in terms of my age, I look at, like when I was in college at Baylor, back then, Baylor, my professors were all, what we would have called back then liberal. Like they were, people are surprised by that sometimes because I was in Baylor before sort of the big wars happened in the Southern Baptist Convention. I was right on the cusp of it, actually. Yes. But like my professors were into, Bultmann and Tillich and Schleimacher. Yes. And I was reading Hartshorne and, like process theology guys when I was 18, 19 years old. And I just gotten saved and had stopped doing recreational drugs a couple of years earlier. Right. And so I was like, I really had a major life change. And so I found it fascinating to read like process theology. And I was almost like, this is like maybe God's evolving, kind of deal. And I thought it was fascinating, but then I really didn't quite buy into it, Yeah. And I found like I would say just really good, smart, conservative theologians that I kind of gravitated toward, like in the end, it would have been like an N.T. Wright, but when I was in college, I didn't have N.T. Wright, but I had other people kind of that ilk. But it's interesting to me, like some kids go to college and they have their Sunday school education, and then they all of a sudden, hit a atheist philosophy teacher in an intro class, and they deconstruct right off the bat, right?
Yes.
I mean, they could be 18 and they deconstruct in college. But other people, it could be a marriage that falls apart, a job that they lose, a health issue. There's something in life creates a crisis. And there are all kinds of reasons why people sort of go from that complexity stage where they feel like they got a lot of answers to all of a sudden, like, holy crud. Like for me, my whole life fell apart.
Yeah.
And it felt like an apocalyptic wasteland of darkness. And like there's nothing left. Yes. And it was just like, I questioned everything I'd ever believed. And I've told everybody, and I felt like an atheist, I just none of it held together. And and part of it was just my own failing, but my own failing had been so rooted in my belief systems that I had worked so hard to develop for 40 something years. Right.
Yeah.
So it was painful for me. Yeah. And you have shame attached to shame because I was ashamed of my own behavior, but then I was ashamed of losing or shattering my faith. Well, and then I had a community of people that, through the years I'd led thousands of people to follow Jesus. And then, and then I'm not holding myself together. You know what I mean? It's a painful deconstruction. And I know as I've listened to so many young people and people of all ages, all the way up to my age, who enter into this stage of perplexity. Sometimes it's an intellectual curiosity and it's fun and it opens up new worlds, but sometimes it's painful.
Yeah. I think you're right. Agonizingly painful, painful to the very brink of survival, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. And every person is different. And I wouldn't say you were kind of late to the party, Fred. I would say that most people stay in stage 2 their whole lives. I think stage 2 is a super comfortable place to be. and people keep it going as long as they possibly can. But when it collapses, and especially, when it's your way of making, it's hard enough to have questions and doubts, but when you make your living by having answers and faith instead of questions and doubts, then it adds a new layer of complexity. Yeah. But as you were saying that, I was remembering, I have a friend who's a pretty famous theologian, retired now. And his mother, I was at his home once, and his mother she was close to 90. I would say she might have been in her early 90s. She was very bright and sharp. And her husband had just died. My friend's father had just died. And I'll never forget, we're sitting in the kitchen. And I guess because I'd written about doubt and this sort of thing, she said to me, when my husband died, I prayed and prayed, and everything that I prayed for, the opposite happened. And she said, it was the first time in my life I've had doubts. And she'd had a pretty comfortable life. Things hadn't gone, she's one of those people who just avoided any major struggle. And then when this came, she just felt like this idea that my husband preached and that I believed that if you're in trouble, you pray, everything will get better. She said, every single thing that I prayed for, the opposite happened. And so here she was, 90 or somewhere around there years old, and admitting for the first time that maybe in the language we're using, she was stepping her toe into perplexity. And so it happens for different people at different ages. I was just talking to someone recently about the life of St. Francis. And I think one of the reasons St. Francis was such an amazing figure is that I think he in some ways hit perplexity at a relatively young age, and hit a lot of suffering at a relatively young age. And I think it's often suffering and failure that brings people to a place where they start asking bigger questions.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to that. I prayed 1 million prayers my whole life to be faithful to my wife and faithful pastor and finish well, and then didn't, and it's like, it's hard. I have a friend who's 30 now, probably. He's African-American, grew up in a white evangelical church as a worship leader. And he was gay, and he tried to pray the gay away his whole young adult, his whole teenage and young adult life. And he was even a mission. And then he finally just realized, I hate myself, and supposedly God loves me. So I'm just going to have to stop hating myself. But that was a painful, because, it led to his entering into perplexity, right? Even though he'd been a short-term missionary and stuff like that. And so many painful stories out there. But then we have this hope of emerging into these new places. If we survive. I like what you say, survival is underrated, right? But, but if we survive it, there's some new places. So let's talk about your newest book, Do I Stay Christian? Because even though this applies to our friends outside the Christian faith, right? It could apply to our people of other faiths can go through these same stages, right? So it's not just a Christian thing.
That's right. I think these are human patterns. Exactly right. And in fact, I've had really interesting conversations with Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and Sikhs and Hindus who would have their own way of talking about their own progression through stages of faith. I'll give you a quick example. I have a Hindu friend, and he told me he grew up Hindu fundamentalist, and when he was a little boy, he had a Hindu Bhagavad Gita storybook, which was like a Bible storybook with pictures. And he said, in Hindu art, one of the ways you show someone is divine, you know how in Christian art, they put a halo around the head. In Hindu art, they made you blue. Your skin would be blue. That showed that you were divine. And so Krishna or Vishnu would be blue. And he's reading this book. His mother's reading this book to him at bedtime. And he says, were there really people with blue skin who look blue? And she said, well, yes, of course. And he said, why don't we see any people with blue skin today? And she said, don't ask questions, just believe what I tell you. and he told me the story to say, I went through the same things as a Hindu kid growing up that you went through as a Christian.
Isn't that great? Humanity. I love the common humanity there. Well, why don't you give us a quick, because I want to dive into each part of your new book, or at least ask a few questions of each part with the time that we have left.
Yes.
And but give us just a quick overview of Do I Stay Christian? Why did you write it? Why is it a sequel to Faith After Doubt? And what are the three parts?
So Faith After Doubt, I wanted to talk about stages of faith and help people, especially in stages 3 and 4, to know that there's nothing wrong with them. It's not their fault. They're just growing. That's why they're in these new stages. And in a sense, I'm also trying to help people in stages 1 and 2 to say, you haven't arrived. There's more to go. And don't judge those people who are at a different place than you. So that was really the big picture. Well, in practical terms, what this means is that people in perplexity and harmony, stages 3 and 4, very often they find themselves being squeezed out of their churches, or they just feel, I go to church and I hear this sermon that makes a lot of people feel better and it makes me feel worse, or it leaves me with so many questions. I'm not inspired. I'm frustrated. And so they think maybe I just can't be a Christian anymore. So my purpose in writing this book is to help those people make that decision. It's not a book that tries to convince people to stay Christian, and It's not a book that tells people to leave and give it up. It's a book that I'm honestly trying to help people. So the first third of the book is the book has 3 parts. Part 1 is called No. Do I stay a Christian? No. And I try to give the 10 best reasons I can think of, and I've heard and I felt, to leave Christian identity. And then the next part 2 is called Yes. And basically, if you've paid attention to those first 10 reasons, is there any way to stay Christian? And that's what I explore in those next 10 chapters. And then at the end of that, I realized that some people are going to stay Christian and some people aren't, no matter who writes what book, because people have reasons for doing whatever they're going to do.
Right.
And then I try to raise the question, how are we going to live, whether we stay Christian or not? Mm-hmm. I actually think the question, how do you want to live, is a more important question than what box you check on a survey that asks your religion. So, so that's the shape of the book.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, I mean, when I went through, I thought, well, gosh, even if there is no God, how do I want to live?
Yes.
And, I'm not saying there isn't a God. Right. I'm just saying that, when I was in my deepest questioning, it's just like, well, I still want to lean into what's beautiful. I still want to lean into creativity. Yes. I still want to lean into love and forgiveness and grace and serving for the common good. And that's the kind of person I want to be,
yes,
regardless of who God is, or if there is one, or what version of God there is, all that. Yeah. I'm thinking about writing a book, 50 Shades of God, and seeing,
That's a great title. It's a great title. But it's true, isn't it? Because you take 100 Christians and the differences in their understandings of God are bigger than the difference between this Christian and that Muslim's understanding of God. So that's great. It's
so fascinating. So I sent you a text after I read part 1, Brian, and all the reasons why we shouldn't stay a Christian. And I finished reading that, and I tell you, I set the book down and I literally, I'm going to start crying again, but I started sobbing, like deep sobs. I'm in the house by myself here, but it felt like, and I'd read all of that before. I certainly resonated with, that critique of Christianity, but you packed it into such a short few pages. And then my own life, the last 3 years, and how all of that just and then just reading it, and I just wept and wept and wept. Man. But, when I was reading the book, and I don't know if this works or not, it's just certainly how I saw it, but it's just one lens that I saw it in. But, I've been in the recovery world, and I thought about, I've been in the 12 steps, 2.5 years. And my first time into that world, I wasn't, I had about a 2.5 or 3 year period of time where I was on Xanax and problem drinking with alcohol, but it hadn't been a part of my whole life. But I've really grown to love the recovery community.
Yeah.
And I thought about, it's almost like Christianity, when it's misbehaving over these last 2,000 years, are like an abusive alcoholic father.
Yes.
And if you read those 10 chapters, like, these are all the ways that Christianity has horribly misbehaved and been abusive, right?
Yeah.
To so many people. And I thought about, like, what does Christianity need to do? Well, they need to do a step 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
They first need to surrender. Surrender all your concepts of God. Surrender all your certainty. Surrender all of the things that you think you know so well that have hurt so many people.
Yes.
Just give up. Surrender.
Oh my gosh.
And then I thought about steps 4 through 7 are a fearless moral inventory.
Yes.
And basically that's what you did to Christianity in the part 1, where you did a fearless moral inventory. And what's interesting is a good sponsor will tell you that when you do a fearless moral inventory, you not only look at the bad, but you also look at the positives. Like, you don't run yourself down completely.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, if you think about your own self and you're in therapy and you think of all the dark, shitty places in your own self, and you do a fearless moral inventory, but then you have to go, okay, well, what's beautiful about me? What's that divine spark in me, that's good. And I thought, part 2 is kind of like that assessment of, gosh, here's all the beautiful things that Christianity has brought to the table, Yeah. And then I thought the last part is how, and I thought, well, that's kind of like steps 10, 11, and 12, because, you're like, you make amends, first of all, for all the shitty things you did. Right. And then you try to live that out in a place of prayer and contemplation and service for the common good. And I don't know. I thought it kind of worked for me, just because I've been.
That works for me. That works for me. I wish I could say that that's exactly what I was thinking when I structured it that way, but you come up with a better explanation than I have. But no, that's a great way to say it. It's a great way to say it. Yeah.
Well,
that's part of the genius. It's the part of the genius of the 12 steps is that a lot of people want to change, but they don't. But just even to give them a path and say, you might not have thought of this, but an essential part of, if you really want to change, an essential part of this is realizing how your addiction not only hurt you, but it hurt others. And let's deal with that.
That's right.
And this is one of the things that I think happens when people go through a faith deconstruction. If they only think about how their religious community hurt them, it can end up, at some point, I just hope that people will then realize, let's face the reality that our religion has hurt other people as well. And a lot of them, and really badly over a very long period of time. And because if we don't do that, then our behavior, then we relapse and our behavior repeats itself. So,
I live in the same area where I pastored, right? So when I go to the grocery store or go to the gas station for the last 3 years, I bump into people that I pastored, right? Yes. And if I get more than 5 minutes with them, privately kind of thing, I've actually done amends to over 1,000 people face to face.
Amazing.
And I thought about that. I thought, gosh, when will this end? Because I was like mountain biking in the snow, and it was 18 degrees, and I bumped into a guy. Like, we were only two on the trail, and we had enough time to stop and talk, and I did an amends. And I was by myself contemplating, and this was just recently, and I was like, God, Lord, is there ever going to be a time when I'm not making amends? Like I've been doing it for all these. But then I thought about this in terms of like how how we've treated, African Americans or indigenous peoples in the land, and all, the colonization issues and the white supremacy issue, all the white patriarchy issue. Yeah. And we're all, in some ways we make amends by the way we live the rest of our life. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, and so what if it never ends the rest of my life? Yeah. If I can help heal people through making amends, right? I don't know. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Oh, I do, Fred. And what seems especially beautiful about that to me is you think in that process of making amends, I become a better person than I would have been otherwise. And I make the world a better place. I make life better for other people. So it's like, it's not just that I did something harmful and now I recover, but as much harm as I caused, I start causing that much good in the aftermath. But to me, there's something about that just feels like that feels right and makes a lot of sense.
And I think about, like I had really good partnerships, still do, with the African American community here in Kansas City, the Hispanic community here in Kansas City. We worked with immigrants and refugees and all these. But even now, as I encounter all of these people who have been hurt by the church, wounded by the church, and I hang out with those people, there's that sense in which we grieve together. We weep together, but then we envision a new future together too. Yeah. And that's a healing process. I think that I like the fact that you did a fearless moral inventory of Christianity. Mm-hmm. It's pretty rough. Yeah. Yeah. But then you brought it around to that side of healing as well. Part two, in the saying yes part, gosh, there's so much here. I like the fact that you put it into this world of how we really can't leave ourselves.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, if you've grown up with the metaphors of Christianity, it's like a heart language.
Yeah.
It's like if whatever your heart language is, that's going to be your heart language. If you grew up speaking Spanish, yeah. Well, if Christianity is your faith heart language, even if you try to leave it, it's like trying to leave yourself.
Yeah.
It's like, how can I get away from me?
Yes.
And so you brought it back to that common sense of humanity that we all have to make peace with at some level or another.
Yeah.
Like, how do I leave myself? Kind of idea.
Yeah.
How do I and I like the thought of how do I reintegrate?
Yes.
And reimagine and transcend and include, as you like to say.
Yes. Yeah.
That's a beautiful piece of it.
And, when you think about that, we're all constantly doing that as individuals.
Right.
We have to do that as nations. If we don't do that as nations, we'll just keep repeating the horrible behavior. So,
yes,
you realize, you look and you say, hey, Russia did some atrocities in Chechnya and in Syria, and then they've never really come to terms with it. They got away with it. And the longer you get away with it, the longer you repeat it. And the Christian faith has gotten away with murder. It's gotten away with horrible, horrible things. And we even see it going on in our country where a lot of white Christians don't want to tell the truth about what white Christians did to indigenous and black people, and or male-led organizations don't want to tell the truth about what they did to women and gay people. And so this act of telling the truth, it brings humility as opposed to pride. And it, in a sense, allows us to then say, what kind of person do I want to be going forward? And that's what a great place to be, to be able to ask that question. What do I want to be going forward? To me, that's freedom. That's freedom.
Yeah. I love the idea of anticipatory Christianity.
Yes.
And you quote, I don't even know how to say the Franciscan nun. How do you say her name?
Ilia Delio.
I love the thoughts in there. Yeah. And then I even went and listened to that podcast that you recommended with Tripp Fuller and John Houghton
John Hott. Yes.
Hott on that was really interesting.
Yes. Yes.
Talk about that. Explain that a little bit, because I think that's a beautiful, that idea of harmony, transcend and include, and anticipatory Christianity, integrating this long history.
Yes. Yes.
Like if we're 200,000 years of Homo sapiens, Christianity's been on the scene for 1% of our history. That's humbling, right?
That's right.
And what do we have to look forward to? The anticipatory side of it.
For a lot of us, this happens in religion, but it also happens in science. People live in a universe that's driven from behind. It's a cause and effect. It's like you are playing pool and you hit the cue ball, and the cue ball hits all the rack of balls, and they're all spreading out. Everything is being driven by something that drove it, driven from the past. That certainly describes part of our experience. But for a lot of people, it describes all of experience. For religious people, they say God planned all this and it all has to happen this way because it's happening according to God's plan. It's the way God hit the cue ball at the beginning and set up the rack at the beginning. It's all got to happen. There's another way to see reality that doesn't exclude that, but it's bigger than that. And it says, actually, I'm sitting here right now, and in a minute, I'm going to have to get off and do another call. And then I've got another call. And then at 5:00, I'm going to be free. And I could take a walk. I could make a sandwich. There are 100 different things I could do. And I get to choose which of those it's going to be. So I don't have a lot of choice in the next couple of hours, but there's going to be an hour that I have a lot of choice and I have freedom. And so if I start focusing not on how I'm driven by the past, but I have opportunities in the future, it creates a different way of life. And here's what's really interesting. You could make a case that the past is gone. We have it through memory and through its effects, but you could make a case that the future is the repository of time that's coming to us in the present. And so the future is filled with unlimited possibilities. And that puts us in the world in a very different way than in a world that's driven by the past. So that's what I mean by anticipatory, to think about the desired future and the possibilities that we could seize.
That's good. In the Vineyard, we always talked about, like, George Eldon Ladd's, already not yet of the kingdom.
Yes.
And then N.T. Wright, a lot of theologians picked up on the already not yet tension of the kingdom. And I just thought that was so interesting that John Hott used the not yet as it relates to God and the future, the anticipatory co-creation with humanity and God of the not yet of the future. And
nothing is done. Everything is in process. Everything's growing, and we can grow toward a better life. We can decay toward a worse life, but it's all there ahead of us.
It's good stuff. Well, we've run out of time, Brian. I could talk for 3 hours on this stuff.
We'll do it again sometime, maybe. That'd be great.
I want to really encourage people who are listening, watching, pick up Brian's book, Faith After Doubt. And then the sequel coming out. When will it hit? When will people get this one?
May 24th.
May 24th, you're going to be able, so this podcast will come out in a few weeks. I thought it was interesting that here on, we're recording this on Tuesday of Holy Week. Mm. And we're discussing, do I stay Christian?
That's right.
While over 2 billion people are celebrating Holy Week. And, but such a good thing. This book, I would encourage all Christians to read this. If nothing else, it gives them a sense of the history of Christianity if they've not ever taken a lot of church history. This is a version of Christianity that you don't usually hear in your local megachurch. Yeah. But you would hear it in a good college church history class, right? And, or a university seminary or wherever, if you just learn church history, but it gives you a really good condensed version of the history of the church as it relates to its worst components. I think all Christians need to know that. It's kind of like your family history, your ancestry tree, right? And then coming to the grips with, okay, well, how do we live? Like, I think Jesus would be pretty shocked about some of this 2,000 years of church history, right? So,
yeah,
how do we live the best of this radical rabbi that we've talked about for so many years? How do we embrace the best of his reimagination of a faith tradition that we've all grown to appreciate and deconstruct and get perplexed over and then emerge into something new. And I love the idea of how all the faith traditions are resources at this point in the future as we emerge. It's anyway, I challenged it in so many ways. Brian, thank you for being with us. How can people find your website?
So if folks go to brianmclaren.net, BrianMclaren.net, they can find links to my books and podcasts and ebooks and social media and all the rest. So brianmclaren.net. And can I just say, Fred, thanks for what you're doing. I'm so glad this podcast, I'm sure, is helping so many people, and your example and openness is helping many people. And I'm honored to be your friend. Thank you.
Well, thanks for being here. Thanks, everybody, for joining us as Spirituality Adventures, and we'll see you next time.
This concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, or subscribe to the social media platform that you're using. And then go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, and make a one-time donation, or you can subscribe monthly and receive our special bonus content. Thanks so much.